Welcome to this German Shepherd pastel pencil portrait. I'm going to be talking you through the process here. Now, this was hours and hours of footage that I've somehow managed to get down to just over half an hour. So there'll be a lot of bits where we're just skipping through me doing effectively the same thing. And I'm starting off with my darkest darks. So for this specific portrait, I'm using two different blacks, which have already been appearing on screen. I'm using the 199 from Faber Castell, which is being used right now, and I'm also using the Koh-i-Noor number 12, and this pencil, which is now being used, is actually darker than the Faber Castell. It's a richer, I would say more velvet black, whereas when we put the 199 next to it, the 199 shows up as being ever so slightly grey, and I just really needed the additional range in my blacks for this portrait. I really needed a very rich, deep colour, and I knew that the Koh-i-Noor would give me that. It's a particularly soft pencil, almost more like a chalk or a Conte, whereas the Faber Castell is a very hard pencil, and the Faber Castells in general are pretty good for working on this scale. But as I say, I wanted a very deep, rich black. So you can see here the Koh-i-Noor is actually dropping pastel dust onto the page. Now, although I'm skipping bits out just because there was so much footage, what I'm really skipping out is showing you me doing the exact same thing over and over again to fill in an area. And this is so important, particularly when you have darks. It is something that I see a lot of in my students' work. So I have full-length tutorials inside a membership, and I talk people through every single step. But what I often see is when people come to put darks down is people get a little bit almost afraid of the medium and afraid of ruining their work and pressing too hard and doing something they can't rub out. And consequently, what I often find when people get to the end of a drawing is that the darks aren't filled in enough, and there's still quite a lot of the grain of the card showing through. So areas like the shadow up on the cranium that I've started to put in, and the shadow in the depth of the ear on the right side, they are really well filled in. So what I do is I swirl my pencil around. I will press fairly hard, but I tend to work in multiple layers even when I want stuff properly filled in. And that just gives me a slightly more open texture to the card. If you think of pastelmat, that's what I'm using, as a kind of like carpet almost. They've got sort of, furry fingers sticking up. If we press really hard over that, then we're crushing that structure. It's like putting a chair on your carpet and leaving it there for a year. When you remove the chair, you can see where it's been. So if I pressed really hard and then decided that I wanted to add more pastel or change an area, that surface is being crushed. It's no longer open, and it is much more difficult to get the pastel to adhere to the pastel mat. So in general, even if I'm saying, I'm pressing harder, then I would probably be using a kind of a moderate pressure, and I go backwards and forwards and build up my layers that way instead. And by swirling the pencil as well, you're really encouraging the pastel to mix in. So what I'm doing now, I'm still working at this stage just with blacks. It's going to change in a moment, but I'm giving myself softer edges. So again, this is where for me, working in layers is particularly great because I'm able to go backwards and forwards, swishing my pencil over areas that I filled in, particularly well, but going over those edges with a kind of grainy texture, I'm able to work the area that has been really well filled in gently out. And so what this does, as you'll see, when the underpainting develops, is it allows me to glaze and blend other slightly lighter, in this case, pastels into these grainy areas and create soft edges. And you don't always want soft edges, but to be honest, as a general rule for your underpainting, you want areas of the different colours and values to be nicely filled in and then to be gently transitioned from one into the other, and that will make it feel like a whole. What I'm doing now is I'm just adding in the low lights to the eyes. Now, there isn't a huge range, particularly in the right eye, of values. It's very dark. So this mid-grey, the 273, is as light as I get in that eye. And the other reflections were actually done with a very dark grey. So there really isn't a lot of range in there, but I've really thought about how I'm placing my values and how they are structured. So you can see on that small right eye, the edges between the reflection and the very dark black. They're quite soft, to be honest. I've softened them. And that is just reducing the contrast again, but I've also made sure that it goes in a small spherical shape, just to describe the shape of the eyeball. I usually make sure as well that when I'm putting a reflection in, there is usually a rim of black around it, so the reflection doesn't sit right on the edge of the eyeball, it's just slightly inside the eyeball, and then as the ball continues to curve away from us, it loses the light again. So it helps with the spherical shape. It's a general rule, but it's a pretty good rule to have. Make sure your reflection isn't touching the actual eyelid, and in general make sure that there is a dark edge around that reflection between it and the eyelid, and it will help make the eye feel more rounded. Now, although this is only the underpainting stage, this is a very small drawing. It is 17 by 25 centimeters, and because of that I approach my underpainting slightly differently. So what you're seeing is, although I'm still only using the blacks, that is going to change pretty soon. Like here's a dark grey, for example. I am working in the fur direction, and you can see that at the moment very clearly. So I'm almost working, not quite, but almost working as I would at the modelling stage. I call it, so the middle stage between your underpainting and adding final details. And you really do want to be continuing the fur direction at this early stage, particularly on small drawings, because we don't add as thick layers, or I don't add as thick layers to my smaller drawings, because you'll struggle to get those tiny details to sit on top clearly. So these directional lines that I'm adding in at this early stage, some of them will be visible by the end, and they will really help to add to the texture. For my larger paintings, I can be a bit more generalistic. I'm not always, but I can just kind of slap the colour down a little bit more in a slightly flat manner. It does depend on the texture that I'm building up. If the textures are particularly thick, then I will bring in texture right from the beginning, but if we've got very flat fur, then it's not as necessary, and it kind of, the texture's built up in the final surface instead, those final details. But when I'm working on a small scale, I really am thinking about the fur direction the whole time. So you can see here, I put in the 182 from Faber Castell, the lovely golden colour, and I've put that in as what you might term a local colour. So a local colour is basically, if we were to try and remove all the tiny little details, what general colour are we left with? And it's a kind of golden brown. So the 182 is a lovely bet for that. And then as we get into the shadows in this particular photo, it gets quite red, it gets warm, and I also introduce a little bit of purple, but the Brunswick 44 is a really nice pencil for this. So I don't often use Brunswick, if ever, in fact, when I'm teaching. Just I try and reduce the range of pencils I use to make sure it's accessible. But as soon as this was a commission that I wasn't teaching, I decided to use my full set, and this is a really nice brown. You can see it's really quite dark. It's quite a soft pencil, so if you're used to your Faber Castell, do be aware you really don't need a lot of pressure through this pencil. And you can see it's very red. So another red brown I often like to use is the 283 from Faber Castell, but the 283 isn't quite as dark as the 44, and it's not as rich. So this is a wonderful pencil to start to get us into these shadows. And you can see I'm going a little bit darker than the 44 with the Stabilo 640 now. And you can see this is a bit more purple as well. I'm using softer pencils for a lot of the underpainting instead of my Faber Castell, which is what I used to use all the time. I've branched out quite a bit more recently. But the softer pencils I'm just enjoying working with, to be honest. But the reason I'm going into these reds and purples as we get darker is because, as a very general rule, you can split your warms and cools by lights and darks. So what I mean by this is, the local colour, as I said, is a kind of golden. So it's sort of an orangey yellow, okay? So if we go with orange, let's say we're sticking with orange as the local colour. Obviously, it's massively reduced in saturation because it's more brown. But on one side of orange, you have yellow on the colour wheel, and on the other side of orange, you have red. Yellow is generally considered to be cooler than red. So a red-orange on your colour wheel is considered to be the warmest colour you can make. So as we move away from the red-orange, we effectively get cooler. So yellow is a little bit cooler, red is a little bit warmer, and these contrast each other, much like black and white do. So by saying I'm going to put my warm values into my shadows and my slightly cooler colours into my light areas, I'm saying that I'm increasing the contrast, much like black and white. And when you increase the contrast like this, you end up with a better 3D effect. Reds also work better at a lower value. The range of the colour red can go quite dark and still be fairly vibrant, especially as we move into the red purples. So the purple wavelength of light is very vibrant when it's quite dark, whereas with yellow, and especially the pigment, if we're not talking about light here, but if we're talking about the pigment that we as artists use, this physical thing that manifests as yellow, the tinting power and shade power of this, if we mix yellow with other things, we lose the colour very quickly. It's very weak, but it works well at a lighter value. So it basically just tells me that yellow is going to work well in my lighter values and red will work well in my darker values. This is something that you learn and you get a feel for, and you'll find that this works really nicely, as I say, to increase that contrast and make your drawings feel more 3D. If you have a browny orange as your local colour, which you will for a lot of your wildlife and pet portrait work, then as a general rule, go into your red browns for your darker colours and go into your yellows for the lighter colours, and it will give you a better rounded effect. So you can see here I've been bringing the underpainting on. Still got quite a few gaps, but I've really got areas that are that purplish brown for the darks, and it sits very nicely with the deep greys and with the blacks. And then as I'm starting to develop the lights, I go cautiously with them. You can see I'm in the orange at the moment. I'm in the local colour, so that's kind of a mid-tone. It's a bit lighter than mid-tone, and I have to say as a side note that Stabilo do a really lovely range of orangey browns, and I particularly love using them. I've only really discovered them in the last sort of year or two. I've been a little bit resistant to trying new brands of pastel pencil, but I do like the range of Stabilo, particularly if you are a pet portrait artist. They are very useful to have, and they work very nicely with the Faber Castell set. I think they complement each other well. In general, I really enjoy the deep browns of Faber Castell a little bit more than the deep browns of Stabilo, because I find that particularly the 177, 280 and 176 from Faber Castell, they're very rich, dark browns. They're very well pigmented, so I particularly like those. What I'm working on here is the structure of this snout, just coming back to what we're doing. And the structure of the snout, if you want to simplify it, it's effectively an oblong. So we have the top plane, which I will develop shortly with lighter values. And I'm quite strict, you'll see in this tutorial, in this time lapse, I'm strict about where I put the light on the nose. I make sure it sits on the top of the snout, and I really think about this box-like shape to ensure that I don't bring the light too far over around to the right-hand side. The right-hand side of this face is in shadow, and I think, again, as beginners especially, you can be very tempted to get overdrawn with all of your details, and you just bring all this light into areas which should be shaded. And I think I do make areas on the right side of the face, to be honest, a bit too light. I have changed it since before sending the portrait out. I tend to sit on a portrait for a few days before deciding if it's finished, because with fresh eyes and effectively a fresh perspective, you will see your mistakes more clearly. You'll also see later on, I fiddle around with the nose no end, and I change this as well before I actually send it to, show it to the clients, because I just, in this one sitting, this was done in a day, it was quite an intense drawing day, in one sitting you stop seeing what you're looking at particularly clearly. So if you're struggling with an area, it is best to walk away from it and leave it alone, because you're unlikely to be able to fix it without giving yourself a proper break from what you're doing. So I'm beginning to develop the lighter mid-tones here. You can see I'm working with quite a desaturated orange. This is almost a peachy orange, to be fair, and it sits really, really nicely with yellows. If you find your yellows that you use for wildlife work look too buttercup and they look a little bit false, then a really great way to tame them is to use a peachy tone or to use a pink. So in Faber Castell, the 132 works really well for this, and it can just, I often say it takes the acid out of the yellow. So if you do find that you struggle with that, particularly if you're just using Faber Castell pencils, because their yellows are quite I'd say quite false, they're not very natural for fur work, then you do want to mix them with a little bit of pink and maybe some tame oranges, and you'll find that it really reduces how buttercup yellow they look, and your creature could go from looking like it's a bit of a cartoon to looking far more natural, because you've mixed your colours together, and it's reduced the saturation of that yellow by effectively mixing it with some pink, and it just pulls the yellow back around to orange a little bit more. It warms it up, and it reduces the saturation. It makes it feel a lot more natural. So at this stage, I'm really starting to work into the details now. That's kind of happened as I've picked up this 692 from Stabilo, so another very soft pencil. And you can see I am working obviously on the left side of the face to start with, really establishing that light. And just look at the difference it made when I put in the light over on the left cheek. We really get such a beautiful contrast now between the left and the right of the face. And this allows me to see the slightly trickier areas in a portrait, such as the muzzle, or potentially areas which are in shadow but cast with some reflected light, and really focus on the big shapes and don't forget about them as I move through the portrait. Something I'll often see when I'm teaching and then reviewing students' work is a loss of the big shapes as students have continued, and they kind of forget about reducing things into, often a box is the easiest way to reduce something down into a four-sided shape, and really just thinking, okay, where is the light hitting directly and where is the light not getting around, and we've got reflected light, and actually it's telling a little bit of a lie, and the photo can make things appear lighter than they really are, especially when we work in isolation. So this is why I encourage students to try and work around a drawing, especially at the early stages, because when we work around the whole drawing and we get all of the paper at least with some amount of pastel down, then we can start to measure these relationships between lights and darks across an entire portrait. And to be honest, until you have all of the page covered, especially when you are learning, it is really difficult to actually accurately gauge these relationships. So what you'll often see is people will focus on an area such as an eye. So that's a classic because it's a feature and it's the most dominant feature to us. We really focus in on them. And then by doing that, they might use too wide a range of values. They might take it too light, they might take it too dark. Haven't thought perhaps about the eye socket structure around it. The eye socket structure is so important. It's as important as the eyeball itself. If there's not a good eye socket structure, then you've kind of got an eyeball that at once feels rounded because hopefully you've got the lighting over the surface correct, but at the same time feels flat because there's not enough depth in the skull for the eye to sit into. So it's really important to just think about the big shapes as you're working. How does a smaller feature, as beautiful as it might be, how does that actually sit in the whole? So again, if we look at this one, we look at the right side of the face, that eye is mostly lost to shadow. A lot of that eye can't really be seen because instead it's shaded by the eye socket, by the brow, and that is coming heavily over the top of the eye. And we just catch a little bit of light on some of the golden fur. But to be honest, a lot of it is in quite deep shadow. And that is helping to then push the box-like shape of the snout forward and out towards us. Those shapes were established loosely early on in the drawing. They're really important, and I never get anything perfect. And as I say, there were things with this portrait that I came to the next day and fiddled with and changed, particularly around the nose. But it's the big shapes at the beginning that you need to come back to, especially when you're starting to struggle. So simplify things by looking at not the details, but at the underpainting values, the big areas of lights and darks and local colour. Because often what happens is you just get overloaded with the amount of details and you kind of get sucked into one area, and perhaps you're struggling to make an area look saturated enough or light enough, and actually you might have got it too bright already and not realise, simply because another area of the portrait isn't yet filled in or hasn't been balanced, it hasn't become dark enough. And so by contrast, the area that you're colouring in and you want to become lighter, it's actually already light enough, but the contrast isn't there against something that's dark enough for you to be able to see the true value of it. So really make sure you work around the entire portrait and don't get sucked into one area. So you can see at this stage, for example, that top left ear, it has been somewhat abandoned from details, but if you're to blur your eyes at that top left ear and then at the reference photo, even though I have paper completely blank in that ear at this stage, the values are, they're very rudimentary, but the values are there and the local colour is there as well. So it's still supporting the rest of the portrait quite well. It does need attending to, but there are other areas that are more important. First, you can see I was just starting to work there on the shadow that's being cast by the nose and hadn't gone dark enough at the underpainting stage. There's also glazing over the top of some of the details that I put in around that area. There's another general rule that's quite useful is if you're putting details in lit areas, then there should be far fewer details in the shaded areas. You can't naturally see detail in the lights and the darks at the same time. It's very much like if you think you're in a dark room, it takes your eyes a moment or two to start to adjust and see things. And so in the same way, we can't see details in the dark and the light at the same time. Your eyes would need to change. The pupils would need to dilate or contract in order to be able to see those details. So you can't see them at the same time. So that's why I generally will put more details in the lighter areas and then soften the details in the shadows. And especially when you take a few steps back from your portrait, do remember to do that. You don't view portraits right up close, which is difficult because we draw them right up close. But when you take a few steps back, you'll find it helps to round things out. And you also just haven't actually got enough pencils to describe details in the lights and the darks at the same time. We haven't got a wide enough range of values. You've got to remember that when we take in the world around us, we are seeing light, we're seeing waves of light. And when we are drawing and painting, we're using pigments. So instead of it being a wave of light, it's something that's solid, obviously very, very small, but it's a pigment, it's quite different. So our range compared to what we see in the natural world, the range of pigments available to us is smaller, and we don't have the same range that we see naturally around us. So that's why as artists, we often group things together, and we will group classically the shadows, we mass them together and make the area of shadow often a little bit more general and one big blocky shape. You'll see that in a lot of classical drawing. And that is just because we haven't got enough materials to describe what we might be seeing in the natural world. We'd run out of the range, the spectrum, we'd get too light too quickly and then not have enough of a range in our light values to describe those at the same time. That's often why artists will work in a value range of about 10. As much as you can get a wider range of values out of your pigments, 10 is quite a comfortable range to work with, especially when you're a pencil artist, as we are. Our pigments are pre-mixed for us, and we don't have the same range or scope of pigments and colours as artists using paint would either. So we're reduced even further. We can obviously mix our pastels together to a point, but the pigments are nowhere near as pure as they are, particularly in artist quality oils and acrylics and watercolours. There's always quite a lot of filler mixed in with a pencil and binder to be able to turn it into this solid form that we can draw with. So there's always quite a lot of other stuff mixed in, and there's nearly always opacity in there as well. There's nearly always white mixed in. So working with artist quality paints is a purer way to work with your colour, and you might be able to get a wider range of lights and darks and colours, and potentially be able to put, you could argue, more detail in, but you don't need that wider range. You just have to be a little bit careful with what you've got, and this is why you don't want to overstate details everywhere. You haven't actually got the range that you might think you do, and you will end up with a flatter portrait because of it. Because if you're trying to describe all of the details that you think you can see in the shadows, you run out of pencils in terms of that range again from light to dark, and then when you get to the lighter values, you can't put in the correct value for those details. So that relationship between light and dark gets smaller, and instead of staying within that, range of the darks might be a value 1 to 3, say, and then you have your midtones and your lighter values, you'll end up creeping into tone 5 in the shadows to get in all those details. So the portrait becomes flatter because instead of just having the darker values in your shadows, you creep into midtones. So everything, at first you think you're doing a better portrait because you think I've got loads of details in here, but by the end it'll actually start to look flatter. So I think this is the point where I start to mix around with the nose. I knew there was something really wrong with the nose, and it wasn't until I came back, as I said, the next day that I really cracked it and fixed it, but you'll see me continually returning to the nose. So I'm using a lovely pencil here, a Caran d'Ache. I don't own a full set of Caran d'Ache. They are very expensive, and to be honest, I don't think they're that incredible. I do think the amount of pigment is beautiful. You know, it's artist quality and they are beautiful like that, but they're so soft that I often find the pencil inside is broken, and when you've spent quite a lot of money on a single pencil, that's not particularly great. I never really get to the end of a Caran d'Ache pencil because it just ends up being crumbly and broken inside by the time I get there, which is a real disappointment. And I do take care of my pencils. I don't drop them on the floor. It's just that they come in the post, so they are ultimately broken inside. But the violet grey I was using from Caran d'Ache is a particularly useful grey. A student put me onto that one. As I say, I don't have a full set of Caran d'Ache. I try and avoid buying them because they're so lovely, but they're so expensive. But she said, no, really must try this one. It's absolutely fantastic, and she was quite right. So I'm really developing not just the colour but the light on the chest now. You'll see me just fix areas of the portrait whilst I'm doing this, and again, so much footage has been cut out because although it can look like I'm drawing quite fast, even the speed of the video is actually being increased for the entire recording on this. I don't actually draw this quickly, I draw slower than this. But as all of the bust starts to go in, so I'm making that colour richer, and over here in particular I'm going to make the value lighter. Again, it comes back to those relationships that I was babbling on about, and how light and dark things actually need to be. So as I'm filling in this area, it's a large section on the portrait really, it can change how the face looks, and I might find that I want more details in areas. I might see that an area isn't dark enough or isn't light enough, and it's again just easier to see these things the more of your portrait that you fill in as you go. So that is why you really should try and get most of the paper covered early on in the portrait, especially if you're just starting out. I know a lot of artists, and myself included, I do this sometimes, will kind of draw a portrait in sections, but I think when you're learning especially, that is a much harder way to draw. It doesn't give you this learning opportunity to adjust things as you go and really start to trust the pencils and processes that you create. You know, artists you see who fill in a portrait kind of from the eye and then grow it out of there, very familiar with their tools and their processes, and they have a better understanding because of the experience of how something will look by the end and how light or dark something actually is. You know, you get to know your materials that you're using. So especially if you're new, I would encourage you to get a full underpainting over the entire portrait before you start going in, modelling the colours and the values, and then of course adding your details. You can see that Bella does look quite different with the bust in. I do a bit more work on that as well, but as I say, I'm returning to areas on the face because it's especially the shine over the cranium that just didn't feel bright enough. And then when I take that brighter, I want a little bit more brightness on the top of the bridge of the nose as well. I was quite happy with the box shape over the nose. Again, everything always looks so different on camera. I feel like the shadows on camera look lighter here than they do in person, but that's just one of those things, totally unavoidable. Small details, as you can see, I've just brightened the reflection in the eye as well. I was really strict with myself to try not to fiddle with the right hand eye. As much as there were more details that I could put in, I didn't want the light to creep around because at the moment it's giving the face a really good structure. And again, that eye looks quite different in person, to be honest. The small reflection by the tear duct on the right hand side isn't nearly as visible in person. It's quite a bit darker, but I suppose it's been contrast the contrast has been heightened through the lens, which is just one of those unavoidable things when you're filming. For the whiskers, I decided to use a Conte pencil, simply because they are very thick and they just show up particularly well over thicker layers of pastel. But you could use anything, and then I always blend the whiskers into the area that they're meant to be coming out of, so there isn't a hard edge there. And that is Bella's portrait complete. It was a really lovely tribute portrait to get to work on, and I hope you've gleaned some useful insights while I've been creating this. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to know more about online classes, then just head over to my website, which is linked below. I have full-length tutorials over there going into a lot of detail to help you get the results that you want to achieve.